Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. And those of you that are here, this is the Empowering Youth Program hosted by myself, prevention educator Ruth Del Pino, and I have myself today a special guest who is a frequent flyer on this program, Melissa Arnold. So we will be introducing ourselves in the next slide. So hello, my name is Ruth Del Pino. I'm a prevention educator for the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I'm the Mercer County Grant Program Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. Melissa, take it away.
Hi, I'm Melissa Arnold. I am a certified prevention specialist here at Mercer Council. I also have had some interesting experiences. I used to work for the ONDCP, which is the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. I was there during the transition teams of Clinton and Bush. And one of our main focuses, ironically, was the beginning of the opioid epidemic with OxyContin, ecstasy, and methamphetamine. So it was an interesting time to be involved in prevention and policy work in regards to substances. I am a certified, as I said, I'm a certified prevention specialist. I am trained in mental health first aid for youth and adults. I'm also a nurtured heart trainer, and I've gotten a lot of exposure here at the council. I've been with the council for 4 years, and one of my specialities that people know me for is vaping and cannabis now.
Which she is very good at. And if you would like to know more about the programs that she teaches, you can go to mercercouncil.org and you can sort of learn about a lot of the things that we all have to offer based on our programs. So I always want to start my presentation with why this presentation, because there are a lot of things that people say, well, this is scary stuff, or this is stuff that's, not easy to absorb, or it's really hard to watch. So I always want to say, one, this is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is also not a parenting class. If you are a parent, you are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've known them longer than they've known themselves. Also to say that this is not a parenting class in that this is for people who work with youth. This is for people who interact with youth. This is for people who have youth in their lives in any capacity. This is really just to learn about how our youth today are being affected by the things around them and how we can sort of help them navigate their realities. Also, my perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences, meaning as a prevention educator, there are a lot of different ways that we obtain information. So it could be a prosecutor's meeting, it could be a community meeting, it could be through an evidence-based program. There are so many different ways and avenues that we obtain information that we take the best on the pulse information that we can and give it to you so that you can understand what that sort of means and what that looks like. Also, this is evidence-informed and some evidence-based. Evidence-informed meaning we take a lot of different studies, we take a lot of different outlooks and approaches to the programs that we use at the council, such as Too Good for Drugs, life skills, nurtured heart approach, those sorts of things. And we use that evidence-based programming and we use it to inform what we do and inform how we sort of make these presentations and look through the lenses for these presentations. Also, once again, any information that you obtain or that we obtain in general through this presentation and with this presentation, we will put the resources and the footnotes below if you are watching this on the YouTube description. And if you're here, you will definitely be emailed the resource list as well. So if you have any questions about any resources, please utilize the chat. And we're sort of going to be moving into our presentation because we want to be as respectful of your time as possible. So I'm going to be starting with medical versus recreational. So a lot of people will be having this conversation about medical and recreational marijuana. And we just sort of have to sort of talk about what marijuana is for a second. Understand that marijuana is the plant itself. There are a lot of different parts to marijuana. There are a lot of different parts to what that looks like. And there are sort of going to be things that are interchangeable here. There's going to be cannabis, hashish, kush, those sorts of things. All those names are sort of nuanced in the way that they have the legality purposes, but also understand that marijuana is marijuana. Cannabis is cannabis. There are going to be things that we're going to be talking about, and the body still interacts with it the same way, regardless of its legal status. So medical and recreational, when we're talking about medical, we're talking about people that have a card that they can use to go into a shop to get CBD products, to help them with their pain relief, to help them with many different side effects that medical marijuana can supposedly help with. Also understand that when we're talking about medical marijuana, especially if you entertain the idea of having a medical marijuana license where you can go in and have those sorts of things, understand that medical marijuana and recreational, there's no regulation right now. There's not a lot going on when it comes to that. They're sort of intertwined in the way that they're treated. And understand that when you walk into something like this, it's not regulated the same way. Doctors aren't in charge of the dosages that you can take. So there are a lot of different roles that we have there. And a lot of people have a lot of questions about this. Why isn't there a more active doctor's role? Why isn't there a more active role in general? Melissa, I see that you wanted to say something.
Right. Well, I can kind of build on that question as well. So one thing that I think is overarching on all of this is while the bill passed, or while the voters passed that they wanted something like this in New Jersey, I want it to be crystal clear that this is still illegal federally, that marijuana in many of these forms. CBD kind of flies under the radar. There are some other hemp-based products, and we could go over a whole ball of wax for that. But one thing I also, there's a terminology that I overheard someone say, that it is marijuana for medical use. It is not medical marijuana because there are only certain parts of this plant that have gone through the rigorous testing and vetting process that true medicine goes through. And that is, USDA regulated and all that. So it's marijuana for medical use. And the doctors' roles, they are still bound by national codes of ethics and of medical standards. And so many of these doctors, they're not necessarily putting their practices at risk because they legally cannot prescribe marijuana, but they can say maybe marijuana for medical use could help you with your symptoms or something like that. The actual dosage and the actual distribution is all done at the dispensary level.
Which in turn, a lot of the people who happen to dispense these sorts of things do not have a background in medicine. So that is also something to keep in mind. And also to note that if you are having any questions, if we're sort of rushing through this, I have 2 more videos and a series for marijuana. So if you have any things based around this, I've already done quite a few different presentations, sort of hashing this out. I did it for 420, so I thought that presentation came out very well. So I will also be citing that source in the description below, and to anyone that is on this Zoom call right now. So understand that any information that we say, we will fill in the gaps if you are a little bit confused right now. Also, just before we touch upon this, we're going to be talking about the CRC, and the CRC is kind of going to be a rolling theme throughout what we're going to be talking about, because they are the basis that gives permission to a lot of different areas of the state to interact with many different environments, including town ordinances, including youth, including law enforcement, and a lot of different areas. So it does affect the way that people interact, and the CRC is definitely something that is a big player in today's conversation.
And CRC stands for Cannabis Regulatory Commission. It
Yes.
is what was established by the state by law to go over that. And there it is written on the slide, Cannabis Regulatory Commission.
So Melissa, this is all you. Oh, you're muted.
So the Cannabis Regulatory Commission was, as I said, established by the actual law to oversee the way that the licensure would be awarded to each municipality. There are meetings that occur every 2 weeks. Sometimes it's varied, once a month, twice a month. These were appointees. When we do an analysis on them, thank you, Ruth. When we do an analysis on who they are, most of them have a deep policy background. If you go to the top and go to who we are, about
You mean
CRC.
the bottom?
Oh no, about CRC. Yeah. Oh, it was right on top too. But these people are very well connected. Many of them have worked in politics, in different avenues and areas, mostly in policy. Jeff Brown did work for the Department of Health for several years. He was one of the ones to oversee marijuana for medical use, and then he kind of transitioned into the recreational or adult use as part of that. Kristen Nash, here on the bottom right, she is the one that has the most medical experience. She is a social worker by trade, and she has been affiliated with several task forces that have dealt with social justice in particular. As you can see, there is a nice diverse racial background consisting of 2 Black Americans, 2 white Americans, and 2 Hispanic Americans as well. So that's the breakdown. Their Twitter, I haven't seen their Twitter.
So their Twitter actually, I did sort of want to interject here that they have quite a few different followers. They have about 3,049 followers, which decent, we'll take it. You know, a lot of people, a lot of nonprofits and organizations struggle to get followers, especially when it comes to something that involves government. So they do announce their public meetings, and that's essentially where it stops. A lot of their PR and things like that are just talking about when we're meeting, why we're meeting. I hear that someone unmuted. Is there any questions? No? Questions, concerns? I don't think so. Okay, so when we're talking about the CRC specifically, there are a lot of different areas. There's a lot of PR when they're saying, we've talked about this, we've done this. We're sort of looking at the different ways that we can sort of regulate serving sizes, for example, or nutrition facts, or sort of FDA-ish approved things. Melissa?
Yes, one thing that I wanted to say about the meetings is that they are public. You actually can submit questions ahead of time. I believe they're about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I believe the next one is August 3rd, which is a Tuesday. So if you're interested in hearing how that process works, you can either go onto their website right here on meetings where Ruth is showing you, and you can actually listen to files about them, or you can register to speak right there. And I believe you can you put the questions there too?
Yes.
Okay. So I definitely advise that if there is some things that you want clarified. Now, right now, a lot of municipalities are trying to develop their own, and we'll get into this later, their own standards of what they want to see the CRC speak out on. But as I said, right now, the main thing that they're working out is licensures, how many they're going to be, and what the parameters are between them. So the last question, who is comprised of the CRC? As I said, policy people. Many have really good political connections. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just when you look at their biographies, there's some just long-term, and I myself am a policy person, so I get it. But one thing that was interesting to both of us is that we wanted a little bit more medical oversight. That's just our personal opinion with something that can affect a body like this. And a lot of people have been saying, we'll treat it like alcohol and tobacco. And as we know, with alcohol and tobacco, the medical community needs to be involved because it does alter the body and the brain, especially of young adults. And that would be a good thing to have. Implications, you know, we have people in business that are invested in this. You have politicians that have made promises based on a lot of this, and we'll leave it at that for you to come up with your own conclusions there.
Yeah. So we're going to be starting talking about opt-in, opt-out. I know that we sort of went back and forth here, so we're going to be tag teaming this. So a lot of people are hearing opt-in, opt-out, and I didn't really understand what that meant until I asked Melissa, because she was asked to be a part of one of these opt-in, opt-out committees. And when we're sort of talking about this, we're talking about the local economy, the transportation of goods. What is the layout here? What's everyone doing? So I sort of wanted Melissa to talk about it, because she really does have personal experience when we're talking about something such as this that can really alter a local economy, but also the way that people interact with their environment in their own townships.
And a lot of local controls. And that's really one thing that we wanted to emphasize to all the municipalities is that since the CRC hasn't put forth all of their policies yet, we don't know what's going to be expected of each municipality. Now, I say this from a place of NIMBY, and you guys have probably heard that abbreviation before. It stands for Not in My Backyard. And essentially it's this. One of the townships that I've been working with, Ewing, had the marijuana, the voters passed it by over 70%. So it's very obvious that Ewing wanted to get involved in the cannabis market and the cannabis industry. However, sometimes those things can change when it is in your backyard. You might feel strongly supporting certain things, but for example, when your child's bus stop is right next to a dispensary, or when there starts to be litter on the ground because of, and this can happen with liquor stores, liquor bottles on the sidewalks, and different things like that. It tends to change the opinions of others and say, wait a minute, I wanted this, but I don't know if I necessarily want it like that. Now, with opting in and opting out, it essentially means just that. Are you going to allow the cannabis industry into your town, or are you going to ask it to not come there? That means the licensures. You will not give out the licenses to operate in your municipality. Now, the interesting thing to know about this is that there is a lock-in. So if you were to say, if your township was like, you know what, we're going to go all in, we trust the CRC implicitly to have everyone's best interest at mind, we're just going to let it ride. We're just going to say we're in and that's it. When you do that, when your municipality does that, they are actually locked in for 5 years. And any business established within that 5 years is automatically grandfathered at the end of that period. So to break that down, that means, let's say the CRC says it's no longer necessary to have smoking prohibitions in parks. I'm not saying that that's occurred, but I'm giving it as an example. But you have, but you really, or, you can't have a dispensary within, 100 feet or whatever. And you really don't like the way that turned out, because you notice that because of that the park has trash in it, and you really wish the dispensary wasn't there anymore. Well, since you didn't specify how many hundreds of feet when you opted in, since you blindly opted in, you're going with whatever the CRC recommended. And if they don't have an opinion on it, you might not be able to put an opinion on it for 5 years. And then if that business is still going at the end of 5 years, when you can make changes again, it's automatically grandfathered in because it was established during that 5 year period. So that's one thing that we really wanted townships to be aware of. So there were really 3 options. You could opt in, all cards on the table, whatever says, whatever goes. You could opt out fully and say, you know what, we can't get it by, we don't know what we want by the September 21st deadline, which is, or the August 23rd deadline, which is really breathing down everyone's necks, because you had 6 months to say what you wanted to do in your municipality. But without knowing what the CRC was going to say, it was kind of a catch-22. So by that date, you can opt in, you can opt out, but you're allowed to opt in at any time. Or you can write your own regulations to kind of have a framework set up so that when the CRC requirements come down, they're already put into a framework of acceptable standards that your municipality feels are fair. Of course, this is going to impact the local economy because of tax revenue. It's 2% on most of the licenses, except for wholesaler retail, which is only 1%. And then I'm not exactly sure how delivery is going to be going. One thing that I wanted to say in the transportation of goods thing is that while municipalities can opt out of the 5 different licenses or 6 different licenses, which include things like growing, processing, distribution, warehousing. I'm just kind of doing an overview here. You can opt out of all of those licenses. You can even opt out of license to allow dispensaries in your township. But one thing, no matter what, you cannot say that delivery cannot happen in your town. Delivery is mandatory in every town in New Jersey. And what's my phrase, Ruth? What do I call delivery?
I don't, what do you call delivery?
Right, it's my DoorDash for hash, because that's exactly.
Oh no.
Rolls their eyes when I say that, but at the same time, it is applicable. That's exactly what it is. Just like we've seen during the pandemic, if you want alcohol delivered, you can get it delivered. It would be the same thing here. Just like I said, DoorDash for hash, you could order, they could bring it. And then what is everyone doing? I don't know if we have time to go to that, but
so I'll just do a quick overview of, and it's just a news article to sort of talk about breaking down some of the cities in New Jersey. And what they're really saying is this is what people are feeling. This is a little bit older. So people may have changed their opinion based on the CRC's recommendations, but essentially what they have been saying, it's been pretty up to date. They're talking about July 7th deadlines and things like that. So this is basically a bunch of ordinances, and it talks about every town in New Jersey and what they had decided to do. So we will be keeping this link below in case we're wondering about, okay, my town Ewing is doing this, or my town Hamilton is doing this. What are other people thinking? So this is definitely something to keep in mind as people move forward to understand what the pulse of marijuana in our town is, or in our state is going to be. So we'll be moving on and moving forth. Thank you, Melissa. That was wonderful. So we're going to be talking about schools just because I think that one, it's important to talk about. Two, that a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on what can be happening in schools. And there, excuse me, there have been a lot of times where I've heard of times where people have brought in vaping pens filled with CBD oil for their children because they medically use it. And there are a lot of different variances to that, a lot of different opinions on that. All I have to say is that using marijuana or cannabis in whatever capacity can definitely hurt the development of the brain. So that's what we're concerned about here. And also understand, we have alluded to this before, but federal versus state is something that we need to sort of differentiate here, that just because it's legal at a state level does not mean that it's legal at a federal level. And because it's not legal at a federal level, there will be many different ways that people can still get in trouble if they have cannabis on their person. So that is something to keep in mind as people move forward, and that children need to understand that they need to be educated on these things, because if they happen to be using, the harm reduction that we need to do is still a lot of work. Also understand that over 21 is the limit, that no matter what, if you are 21 and older, you are able to engage in cannabis recreationally. But that does not mean that under 21 can, and the usage versus recreational use is definitely something debatable, meaning that if you are using and you are providing something with something to someone under the age of 21, is it being treated the same way as alcohol? There are a lot of different opinions on that, and we will be talking about that when we do our law enforcement slide. So that will be something that is brought up. But also understand that there are a lot of different gray areas that schools really need to latch on to that they have not been able to, because the CRC, one, hasn't been given a lot of guidance for that, but two, also understand that schools, when they're interacting with this, may feel like they really can't do a lot. And one, we need to recognize that you are not alone. There are a lot of different people that feel they have their hands tied, but understand that there are a lot of different ways that people can understand the policies so that they can use it to rewrite their policies and to adhere to government guidelines and make sure that they're respecting the autonomy of each individual in the conversation. Also know that programs were designed to address cannabis use disorder. The shortened version is CUD, because we are seeing a rise in cannabis use disorders. There will be another slide that we're talking about in drug prevention, and we will be talking about that more in the meantime. But people are addressing this. They are seeing the numbers growing. They are seeing how people are interacting with cannabis and how it really does affect, one, the school day, but two, how people are obtaining it, where they're obtaining it from, and where they're actually using cannabis within the school grounds. So that is something to also keep in mind as you move forward. Also know that school drug-free zones are not impacted, as well as school disciplinary actions or policies. Yes, there may be some ways that schools may work around these policies, but in general, the policies that you have in your school surrounding cannabis and things like that are still going to keep in place, but people can still be worried about these things. Yes, Melissa.
that was a great concern because of the way that juveniles are handled in the legislation. Law enforcement really felt like there was a hands-off kind of thing, and so schools who had worked with a resource officer or police departments in the past have said, well, we can't do anything either. And a lot of ordinances had to come out from a lot of their governing bodies that said, no, a school is still a school is still a school. Now, if part of your policy is turning things over to the police, you can still do that on an anonymous basis. But you can't just invite the police in to search lockers anymore. There has to be a school policy to go on first.
And we will also be talking about some of the law enforcement aspects as well, because the law enforcement aspects really do touch upon some of these school policies that people may have engaged with before, but can no longer or are at a limit for. So that will be something that people have great concern for that we will be addressing later on in the presentation. So once again, if you have any questions or concerns, let us know, because this is something that a lot of people are curious about. So just, keep the chat box going if you have any questions. So Melissa? Oh, you're muted.
So one big thing on the preventative side is that there were a lot of private property and social hosting ordinances that were passed in many of the municipalities here in Mercer County and all over the state. And they had to do with parents who provided alcohol and substances to children who are underage, as well as college students. If you think about it, 3/4 of college students are technically underage, and usually the upperclassmen are the ones buying, upperclassmen are the ones buying the substances. And so social ordinances and private property and social hosting ordinances were put into place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But as the municipalities have started to roll out their ordinances, they feel that the new marijuana legislation directly contrasts against that. So one thing that was put in there is that it repeals the statute that prohibits municipalities from adopting an ordinance prohibiting underage consumption of alcohol and cannabis on private property. So that is, to us as prevention people, we are very concerned about that, because that could cause more less perception of risk for young adults, less consequences for their use of these kind of substances. And of course, this can lead to health scares and other things as well. When a rule is in place, it's always good to have something to go along with it. And these have been repealed on a municipal level, which means even if, I know a lot of the shore towns are really opposed to retail establishments of cannabis, but even if they're opposed to people giving use or underage things on private property, this still repeals whatever ordinances they have in place.
So I also want to add that when we're talking about private property and social hosting ordinances, understand that when people are given permission, or a group of people are given permission, the implication that a lot of youth have is that, one, they always think they're older than they are. That's just something that youth are really good at engaging with. But understanding that they say, oh, I'm 20 years old, it's fine, I can smoke. Or I'm 20 years old, it's fine, I can drink. So understand that when we are giving permission to certain groups to use or to more freely use, then other groups that are underage or that really shouldn't be using can engage in those practices as well, because there's a baseline permission that is given. And when we take away certain parts and certain mitigating factors, then we are giving permission to those people to engage in those risk-taking factors, which can be very hard and very not good for health, but also not good for social aspects as well, in that once you use, you may be driving under the influence and affecting other people's lives. You can cause car crashes, you can cause social and economic impact on other people based on the permissions we give certain groups that imply other groups on top of that. So this is why this is a great concern. It's not just a thing that says, oh, let's just let people have their individual choices and realities. It's that with these individual choices and realities, a community is around those choices and realities. So when we are and the impact of that. So it's not just one thing, it's understanding a holistic perspective on how it really affects certain parts. And that doesn't mean every part is good or every part is bad, but we need to look at it in a way where we can prevent as much loss of life, loss of social capital, and loss of good well-being for other people to thrive in the environments that they interact with. Anything to add, Melissa? All right, I'm off my soapbox. So we're going to be talking about law enforcement next. I think that this is a great resources for us to have because the Attorney General, Melissa shared this with me. The Office of the Attorney General did a frequently asked questions with law enforcement, and there were a lot of different PDFs that you can engage with. So there are some here, and I think that when we're looking at this, we need to understand that the questions that were understood are that these are for under 21. This isn't for over 21. We're talking about youth here. This is an empowering youth program. So this is our focus, but there are many different avenues that we can talk about. And if you are more interested in the policies, there are a lot of different resources and we will be touching upon those as well. But there are some questions here. And I think that when we are engaging with this, we need to understand that this is with the information that the Attorney General was given at the time, given the scenarios that were posed in that meeting. So, for example, what should an officer do if they smell marijuana coming from a vehicle during a motor vehicle stop? So, when we are looking at this, this is actually one of the biggest things that had changed was that there's something called, I believe it's reasonable cause or reasonable cause. Is it reasonable cause, I believe, Melissa?
I believe so.
Yeah, it was reasonable cause or reasonable suspicion. I can't remember exactly the terminology, but essentially what they had said was that just because you smell something does not mean that you can engage in that practice. Just because you smell something on that person does not mean that that can be something that can be taken away from that person, that that person can be charged with, because it is something that is not visibly shown. There is nothing that you can visibly see for that to happen. So that was something that officers were saying, well, there have been a lot of times where we smell marijuana. There have been a lot of times where we smell these sorts of things in these areas. Why can't we engage in that process? Because it is reasonable suspicion that is reasonable for us to understand and for us to engage with. So that was something that a lot of officers were having a hard time understanding. And this can be hard for people to come to terms with because this bill and this part of the bill was written in a way where it was meant to affect less youth and for them to stay out of the prison system or stay out of the legal system in whatever capacity, and to also protect a lot more communities of color. So we will also be talking about the racial disparities on top of that, because this is part of the bill as well, and that was a selling point for this marijuana legislation. So I do think that anybody can read through this on their own time, but overall for the bill to understand it, engaging with under 21 people, there is less of a there's a 3 warning strike system. I believe that at first it was after the 3rd strike that someone had used that they were notifying the parents, but now they had rearranged it and changed it and codified it to say that after the 2nd, or was it the 1st strike? It was the 1st strike, right?
Right.
Yes.
So the 1st strike, the parents are notified. On the 3rd strike is when they are recommended to get other resources for help.
And this is also another, my apologies, this is another Q&A with the Office of the Attorney General that had happened before then as well. So this is something else that you can look at. And just to know that the resources are out there, that, there are a lot of people saying a lot of things about the bill, but doing your own research, understanding where it's coming from, understanding what the policy actually says will help sometimes mitigate that frustration. Also, medical and recreational, when we said before that we're transporting marijuana, that you can be 18 in order to to transport marijuana, you're just not able to use it. So understand that when people under the age of 18 are transporting marijuana, they're not doing anything wrong. It's not against the law under this particular policy. There also are secure lock boxes to make sure that the person under 18 will not be able to engage in that. And also they are approved people who will have these driver's license to transport this marijuana. There are a lot of statistics on robbery. I was going to put a lot of different statistics there, but I think that I also have another presentation that touches upon this very heavily. So we're going to keep that out just for now, but understand that when people transport cannabis, they are more a target for robberies and crimes against them due to the volume of cannabis they may be using. Melissa, do you want to talk about this video?
Well, one thing that we wanted to kind of convey is that although we know a lot about the bill as it's currently written, or the law as it's currently written, it's being reinterpreted every day. And so and I think one of the groups that is having difficulty in adjusting to the changes is law enforcement, because sometimes they feel like they can do this or they can't do this, or they have to be hands off here or they have to be enforcing here. And so one of the problems with law enforcement in particular is sometimes there isn't that hard evidence, like with a blood alcohol, a breathalyzer for alcohol, like a breathalyzer for alcohol or something like that. So this is a cute video I found. This is just for fun, just to kind of highlight the fact that this is an ever-changing field, and we're learning stuff every day, and we're trying to apply our knowledge in the best way. And we have drug recognition experts on each police force, and they're getting trained and trying to figure out how to navigate this. So this is the Canadian version of how they're trying to navigate it, and it is just for fun. I want to emphasize that.
This car has been stopped for quite some time. I'm going to check it out. Excuse me, have you been smoking any pot today?
No.
Well, you've been stopped here for 15 minutes. Can you tell me why that is?
We're waiting for the stop sign to turn green.
How high are you?
Hi, how are you?
No, I said, how high are you?
Hi, how are you? This cop is so friendly, babe.
Okay, I am going to have to conduct a pot sobriety test.
Oh man, I'm too high for that.
Blow into this?
Hey, is that a breathalyzer?
No. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a few questions to determine your ability to drive. Why is a pizza box square when the pizza's a circle and all the little slices are tiny triangles? Which of these two snacks would you prefer? Chips or the cookie dough? Step out of the car, please. Let's go.
Please, don't drive high. We're getting cookie dough all over the back of our cruisers. A message from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
That's always a good one.
I did have to say, I did show this to some law enforcement that I was doing some training on, and bless their heart, they cracked up right along with me. And I'm not making fun of law enforcement at all. And we're also not trying to downplay the fact that driving under the influence is still dangerous. But man, that's funny. So we just thought it would be a good break in between some of the policy stuff we're just throwing at you. So.
Yeah. So we also want to talk about the effect on prevention education, meaning our specific fields, what we do with, what we engage with every day. So Melissa, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So we are, as we said, we're prevention educators, which means we're not just the just say no people. We're trying to educate so that people can make choices for their own lives with the information that they might not have. So the sentiment, obviously, this is one thing that we're worried about right away is because it's legal, because the conversation has changed, because adults are feeling this kind of freedom, we're worried about the perception of risk. And when we do surveys on this sentiment, we do a community survey every year. we would love to give a plug for you guys to do that. It's on our blog, on our website, mercercouncil.org. It's a really quick survey monkey. It'll take you less than a minute. But we've noticed the perception of risk of marijuana. The question was, how do you feel? There's two of them. Can marijuana be just as dangerous as alcohol? And in the past years, we've seen a lot higher rates of people saying, yes, it is just as dangerous. And in this last half of the year and last year as well, we saw that number going down. The other one is, would you worry about your child doing cannabis or doing marijuana, or smoking marijuana? And that number has gone down as well. So there is this perception of risk that is changing in just the culture in general because of the just some of the information out there and the fact that it was legalized. Did you want to start with CUD?
Yeah. So I sort of want to talk about CUD. A lot of people call it a lot of different things. Colorado called it marijuana use disorder. It's sort of being coined now as cannabis use disorder. And understanding that Colorado was sort of the breakthrough state of talking about, let's talk about cannabis, let's talk about marijuana, let's use it to use the taxes for our schools, let's use, you know, a lot of different ways that we can get revenue for the local economies to make this state flourish more. And what they had seen, and the Denver Post had reported in 2018, that marijuana addiction is actually on the rise, that there are more people going into rehabilitation with an addiction to marijuana. And a lot of people can argue you cannot be addicted to marijuana, that there are no substance use disorders from marijuana or cannabis, but understand that just because it is not something that you can be chemically addicted to the same way you can in other places does not mean you cannot be habitually addicted to it. And if you use it for your anxiety, if you use it as a coping skill, you can most definitely become addicted and have a substance use disorder from it due to the reality that you rely on it so heavily. So I do want to click on this just to tell you that it's real, first of all. And so what they are seeing is an estimated 9% of marijuana users become addicted to marijuana. Now, this is obviously a big jump to a lot of people that say only 3%, only 2%. There have been quite a few different studies on what addiction actually looks like and how you can actually become addicted to marijuana. But understand that when they are talking about this, that the younger a person starts, the more likely they are to become addicted to marijuana or cannabis or really any drug in general. And so there are a lot of different great numbers in here. It says the percentage of people who become addicted to marijuana, about 9%, and about 17% of those who start in adolescence also has been stable. Some studies report that even higher proportions of marijuana users develop a dependence, which means they experience withdrawal symptoms when they stop using the drug. Now, understand also that marijuana is something that not everyone engages in regularly, but these are people that started using it regularly through time, over time daily, sometimes multiple times a day. And that's when we really start seeing the effects, one, on their pocket because they're spending a lot of money on it, but two, also socially, where everything they do is based around marijuana. And that can really affect the way youth interact with their environment, especially in New Jersey, to understand that now that they have access to it, now that they have more people that have access to it, now that there's a group of people that have permission on those drugs, that have permission to use those drugs, they have access to that as well. It's the same concept as alcohol, at least in this capacity, to understand the access and the highways that people can take to get it in the first place. Also, there are a lot of prevention education programs because Colorado actually saw a rise in marijuana use and cannabis use disorder, that they actually started prevention services and prevention resources that are specifically tailored to marijuana. Because there are a lot of different ways that people can talk about it. So this is something to understand. This is something that we need to keep in mind as we're moving forward, that there is not just one way of us looking at it, but understanding the cultural context of a drug and understanding the ramifications that each community has based around using it.
Another thing is that in Colorado, in the law, when it was affected, they said that a percentage of their resources were going to go to prevention education and to youth services for try to stop youth use. Currently, as our the act stands, We do not have that written in. And that is of great concern to us in the prevention agencies. A lot of people are going to it on the municipal level and saying, hey, out of this money that you're getting from the industry, can we set this much aside for prevention education?
Yes, thank you, Melissa. Also, thank you for bringing that point up because it is something that is of concern. Also know that cannabis use disorder is a real thing and that there are a lot of doctors that are talking about it right now. Healthline.com was talking about it as well. And people said that essentially that 12 to 17-year-olds, it went up, the cannabis use disorder went up 25% in legalized states since it was approved for recreational use. So that is something to keep in mind. Those are some pretty big numbers. And you can say, oh, it's a small percentage, but it's not zero. And that's something that we're striving for. Melissa?
Okay, so one thing that we wanted to talk about is, does it affect rehabilitation centers? And we kind of need to start with the history of other substances on this one. Tobacco and alcohol companies have long tried to obfuscate, I think is the best way to say it, their impact of their products on a population. And one thing that we're seeing is that these are these two industries in particular are heavily invested in the cannabis industry. Now, one thing that we were talking about, Ruth and I, is that drug rehabilitation centers, a lot of times when people are trying to break a dangerous addiction, mostly on opioids or other stimulants, we have seen, and this is mostly anecdotal, but we have seen some numbers that a lot of them still smoke tobacco or nicotine products as part of their recovery, kind of to replace some of those endorphins. So what will this affect it now that marijuana is legal? Will they allow people to smoke cannabis as part of their recovery? What does the recovery community consider clean? If you think about it, alcohol is legal as well, but many people in drug rehabilitation or substance use programs are trying to get away from alcohol as well. So that's an interesting caveat that we're also thinking about this. Alcohol, as I said, the tobacco industry has already shown that they are heavily invested in this, mostly in the growing and processing side because they already have that experience with tobacco. But alcohol, surprisingly, has really stepped up. In one particular case, there is a company called Constellation Beverage, and I believe Heineken is one of their products, and they have heavily invested, I think it was $1.2 billion in the cannabis industry because they want to launch lines of cannabis infused products. So I guess one thing, it doesn't really go with drug rehabilitation centers, but one thing that I often tell my students is, are the alcohol and tobacco industries ones that have always put people's health first or economics first? And that's one thing that we have kind of been focusing on with the emergence of this industry. With co-occurring substance use disorders, I get this question all the time. Well, if cannabis is legal, won't people stop using opioids? Won't people stop drinking alcohol? That's really not what we're seeing. We are not seeing that at all. In fact, there are numbers to back up the opioid idea. There's not a lot of causality. Unfortunately, with numbers, they can be skewed. So obviously, we're looking for causality. Are people not using opioids as much because they're using marijuana or cannabis? You know, those things are really hard to determine. Or did the number of opioid users just happen to go down and the use of cannabis went up? But what we're seeing mostly, especially with alcohol, is co-occurring use. So they're not necessarily replacing alcohol with cannabis, but they're using cannabis when they're drinking.
Yeah, and we see that a lot in a lot of different ways. And people would argue, they say, well, I've done so many much harder drugs before. If I use marijuana now, that's a harm reduction strategy. In its own right, yes, one is less bad for you than the other, but that doesn't mean it's not bad for you. And that doesn't mean that it's not something that can hurt the development of your brain. Also, to understand when we're talking about tobacco companies, just to harken back to that for a second, is to say that the tobacco companies invested in New Jersey specifically. They own, I want to say, I saw the numbers in 2018. So the numbers have definitely been skewed since then. And to understand that, the CRC would have to be more involved in that process. So we're looking for those numbers as they come forward, is that they owned more than 50% of the marijuana grown in New Jersey, meaning that 50% of the marijuana grown in New Jersey is owned by tobacco companies, meaning that their initiative and their motivation is not to help racial disparities. It's not to help the local economy. It's to gain money for their multinational corporation so that they can use that to further their wealth, to further their gross domestic product. So that is something to keep in mind, that just because it's in New Jersey does not mean that it's owned by New Jerseyans, that it's owned by people who want to make their local economy better. That is also something to keep in mind as we move forward too. So yeah, I talked about money for that one. So we're going to be talking about the racial disparity because it has been something that's been popping up, and we need to talk about why it matters. So why does this matter? First, marijuana has been something that has been politicized for a very long time, this past century, but to also understand that the people of color, especially Black and African American individuals, are the ones that are the most affected by every drug in the United States, but marijuana specifically has been something that is especially racialized. And when we are talking about this, the reason why it matters so much is because New Jersey and the way that the people were saying this could be a really good policy for people of color. What they were saying was that we can rewrite the policies to make sure that people of color don't end up in jail for things that are not necessarily federally offensible. So these were the things that people were saying, let's use this policy to help other people stay out of jail, to take people out of jail, to make sure that, yes, let's get them the sort of help that they need, but also invest in certain programs to make sure that these people stay out, these people understand the ramifications of such actions. So what we are seeing is that there is definitely a response to Black folk and people of color, especially Black Indigenous people of color. But what we're understanding here is that they haven't had to come up with any numbers yet. So there's no real policy that talks about and protects people of color as of yet, besides the law enforcement aspects where you can't necessarily arrest. Instead, you would be given a fine. So the commission, and I just want to cite the policy for a second, said the commission shall conduct a disparity study to determine whether race-based measure should be considered when issuing permits pursuant to this section and shall incorporate to the policies and permits. So when we were talking about this, what we are understanding is that certain people were promised policies so that they can move forward through that. I don't see Melissa anymore. I think she may have been kicked off by the Wi-Fi. So I will be ending this presentation. But I do want to talk about this when we're talking about micro businesses as well. So a lot of the time when they were talking about the racial disparities that exist within this policy, they were saying they're going to be giving preference of licensures to Black Indigenous people of color, saying that we would work on micro businesses, micro loans to make sure that people who want to grow their local economy are given these loans so that they can invest in that economy and, start something, use something for themselves to help bolster possibly their passion. Also, to begin to dismiss and resolve existing juvenile and adult cases. Those are something that are that they want to be absolved, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be absolving that. So I have a video. It's actually called it's on Vice News. So Vice News does this sort of one-on-one reporting, this sort of nitty-gritty stuff. But what they had done was that they actually interviewed a New Jersey weed man who was a person that is a very big advocate for everyone using cannabis and using recreational marijuana. But what we need to understand is that he actually voted against the marijuana policy that had been passed in November when we had voted on it, because he said it does not protect people of color the way that we were promised. It does not talk about the things that we wanted to talk about. So I think he can say it better than I can, so we're just gonna move straight into that. And excuse me, there's always, I believe this is an alcohol. Yeah, this is an alcohol advert right before the cannabis policy. So that just comes to show who they know is happening and
We
what they're
have now
doing.
in New Jersey is not legalization. It's more like corporatization. The plan is to have these big corporations come in here and provide all the marijuana for people. There are lots of people all around the state who are openly selling marijuana right now, even though our laws are all being written for the corporations. I don't know what they're going to do. Arrest us all. Who's going to convict us?
So we're into 2016. You get busted. You end up getting off on the weed charge, but what happened?
They charged me with possession with intent to distribute. They grabbed a couple pounds of marijuana.
But it's true, though. You did have possession, and you did intend to distribute it.
Yes, okay, I was, all right? But this is America. The founding fathers of this country felt that there would be times when the tyrants of government will write laws that the people didn't accept. The marijuana laws are exactly that.
I've talked to Governor Murphy, and he said the days of mass incarceration are over. This cannabis legalization initiative, this law, is about social justice.
He does a lot of talking, but again, let's see actions. Actions would mean guys like me, guys who went to prison trying to become millionaires, don't have to be millionaires to sell weed now. I got a jail cell, and now they're allowed to sell. No, I got a jail cell.
So what are your, and I want to hear very specifically, list of demands from the Cannabis Commission in New Jersey to make it something you would want to participate in?
Home grow for everyone. I should be allowed to get a license to grow marijuana myself. Anyone who has a felon for marijuana charges, not only should they get an expungement, but they should get an exemption for marijuana licenses. We went to prison for selling weed. Now, we'd like to be allowed to sell weed. We don't want a jail cell again.
To make sure that doesn't happen, we decided to link up with one person up in the governor's office whose goal is to make sure fewer Black people in her state see a cell. Where does equity really rank in your commission's job in setting up the rules?
I see our work as centering really around two core values. I call them twin values, equity and integrity. Equity ranks at the top. It's very much connected to everything that we'll be doing at the commission.
The thing that I've learned from every state that I've looked into is that capital is the biggest barrier for communities that have been unfairly prosecuted by the war on drugs in the past. What do you think New Jersey is going to do about capital being the biggest issue?
The fact that we don't have any caps on the number of micro businesses that we can have in New Jersey is going to be a tremendous asset.
So if you didn't know, that was the CRC chair. That was someone that we had introduced before talking about the CRC. And when we're talking about this, also understand that when she was talking about the micro businesses, we are talking about small business sizes, limited employees, but less experience needed. And the micro businesses and the micro loans that we're talking about, that was meant to set aside for a lot of people of color that may have had a lot of generational trauma that could not afford to start these businesses. But when we're talking about starting a business, you have to have, in order to apply jointly, $200,000 to $400,000. Now, that doesn't sound very much like you can necessarily afford to start something if you're just one person, meaning you would have to jointly combine with a lot of different people. So does that really mean that you're starting your own business? That could mean that you're starting a lot of partners, that people have an investment, that you have stakeholders. That's something that a business plan can actually accommodate. But understand that when we're saying micro businesses, we're not talking about one person having a passion for starting a cannabis store. We're talking about several people that have to come together, that have to make the money, that have to accommodate and pool that money to start something, to even have a chance to apply. So that is something to keep in mind. And we have this is basically the end of the presentation because we are running out of time. And I hope that anyone that needs to come off the presentation, you can. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all of that. But I want to close with saying that strength does not come from physical capacity. It comes from an indomitable will. And this is by Mahatma Gandhi. And when I say this, and when we introduce something like this, understand that a lot of people may feel helpless. A lot of people may feel like they have their hands tied. A lot of people may feel like they're not they're fighting the fight that is they can't win. It is losable. And understanding that that doesn't mean that just because this cannabis policy passed that we're on the losing end of something. Understand that because this cannabis policy passed, what are the reasons why it passed? What are the sentiments behind it? What are the ways that we can interact with it to make people safe? And understanding that disparity and the history behind certain policies and the history behind the way that people interact with a certain drug or way of life means that we need to understand that first before we move forward and have the strength and the capacity to sit with those realities and formulate something that can really be helpful to the whole community. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your dedication to learn something new. We will be talking about Generation Z. Are they more primed for substance use disorders next week? So thank you and hope to see you then.